Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle and thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com. Join me if you haven't already at the Sonic Cinema Patreon at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. I just put, last week, I just put a rewards online of my very first solo audio commentary. Nobody's ever heard this one besides me. It's a scene select commentary for some scenes in the comedy American Pie 2. And I explain a little bit there as to why I chose that particular movie and why I chose those particular scenes. Coming up, there's also going to be some more discussion on the book, as well as some exclusive reviews coming up, as well as maybe some more commentary and audio with regards to my music. So that's patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by a writer and director who has sent me some of my favorite films of the past few years. He's one of the filmmakers behind Chimp films. He's a writer-director behind Joke, Jay, Sea Change, Sultan of the Sea, and many others. I'm pleased to be joined today by Nickolas Duarte. I'm really pleased to be joined today by one of the filmmakers behind Chimp films, Nickolas Duarte. He is a writer and director who has sent me a number of short films over the years, including What You Need and Joke, as well as Sea Change, Sultan of the Sea, and a documentary short that he sent my way last year called Jay, which landed pretty high on my top 10 list for last year, and I watched it in preparation for this interview, and it definitely held up just as well this time around. Thank you very much, Nickolas, for joining me.
Yeah, man, I am very excited to do this. You've always been a strong supporter of the work and a strong friend in getting the word out there. So I'm excited to chat with you a little bit about these projects.
Yeah, and as am I, because you're by far one of the most interesting voices I think I've ever gotten the chance to watch their films from, as far as people who have sent me their films. And that really came through as I was going through and rewatching these films for the sake of this interview. And I'm really curious to talk to you about a number of these titles.
Yeah, well, I definitely appreciate that, man, and I'm glad to hear that they're having some sort of an impact on you. So thank you.
Well, first of all, like I said, you are one of the filmmakers behind Chimp films. I'm just kind of curious if you want to explain to the listeners what exactly is behind Chimp films.
Yeah, so Crown Chimp, we started it going on about 12 years now. And it is basically a small collective production company where we, most of the income comes from doing commercial work.
Mm-hmm.
And if you like, I can dive into that quite a bit. But then we also use that income to support the financial or support the personal projects, the experimental projects, everything of that nature. And then that started leading to us getting a little bit more attention in the narrative world and in the film and television world. So it's it's this group of filmmakers. It's myself. I own the company and I'm the primary director and I write. A gentleman named Frank Armendariz, who is also a director and an editor with the team. Sonia Campbell, who does all of our social media, is a producer and a very talented writer and art director. And then Drew Grubik, who is a writer and a producer and, outside of me, the longest member of the Crown Chimp team. And then from there, there's other people that we work with, but that's the main core of our group.
Mm-hmm. And where can people find you guys on the web? Just to go ahead and get that out there.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate the early plug. So it's very simple, crownchimp.com. And then we're on Instagram and Twitter as at crownchimp. You can also find us on Facebook, and I believe that one is Crown Chimp Films.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe so. Well, let's go a little bit more personal though. And what exactly drew you to filmmaking in general?
Yeah, so I grew up always very interested in the arts and creativity. I was constantly writing, constantly drawing, constantly coming up with odd little stories. All of that type of stuff that a overly imaginative kid does when they're young. Uh, so that was a big part of that. My mom was very interested in, making sure that I was involved in the arts of some kind. So we didn't really have a lot of money growing up, but, she made sure I went to the kind of Parks and Rec programs and the things that, the city or the county would provide, those types of programs, and, made sure that I was, that aspect was being nurtured.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side of that, my dad was, very involved in athletics and, fueled that side of me as well to, make sure that, I was maintaining the discipline and the motivation and the excitement that you have to have in sports. So, those two components converged pretty perfectly when I was about 17 years old, and I made my first little film is just for a high school project, but it was really that kind of combination of the arts and athletics, that sort of competition and discipline mixed with just a raw need to express yourself, that mixed perfectly for filmmaking.
Mm-hmm. Well, what filmmakers have inspired you over the years?
Yeah, I would say early on, probably, some similar names as anybody else my age. So I'm in my early 30s. So, when I was first getting involved into film in my late teens, early 20s, it was, people like Paul Thomas Anderson and Michel Gondry, a little bit of Terrence Malick and David Fincher. And then I
Mm-hmm.
would say, as I've gotten older, uh, Bennett Miller is the one that I
Mm-hmm.
continually look at as, that's the guy. That's the work that I'm really enjoying right now. I've also started to really enjoy the work of Reed Morano, and Cary Fukunaga, some of their work in episodic as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And when you mentioned Paul Thomas Anderson and Terrence Malick, I mean that's one of the thing that is something that very much I feel like comes through in a lot of your films, and in that it feels like a lot of the films that I've seen, and they're all short films. I haven't actually seen a feature film from you. And there's a very tone poem and visual experimental quality to them, and that's something that really strikes me about all of the films that you've done, regardless of whether it has a straightforward narrative or whether it's just sort of this germ of an idea that comes through, and that's going into that, we can go ahead and start talking about some of those films. The first film I believe I saw from you is just a 4 minute short called "What You Need," and it's a very interesting short. I don't want to give away too much about these films. Just needless to say, if you haven't seen them and you're listening to this, they're really well worth watching. And if you're a fan of some of those filmmakers that Nickolas mentioned earlier, I think you'll definitely see the strong connection that they have to those filmmakers. Where did you come up with the idea for What You Need?
Yeah, well, just to touch on some of the other stuff too, I think one of the things that I'm very interested in is trying to express things that you can't verbalize,
Mm-hmm.
and just more so feelings that a combination of images and sounds and performances, help you to at least not necessarily make sense, but it's more for me trying to make sense of the world or whatever I'm going through at that particular moment. And the story and everything else is a skeleton to try to work off of.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but in particular with what you need, and that started off with a very very different approach. So the initial thinking on that was, we were going to do an opening logo for the company, for Crown Chimp,
Mm-hmm.
and like this idea of like, okay, let's this image of this small kind of chimp creature wearing a little crown, and then that kind of turned into away from animation because we don't really do that into live action, which turned into this central idea of, oh, what if it's a little boy that's kind of a chimp,
Mm-hmm.
steals a crown, and then from that it turned into a much larger. I don't even know if larger is the right word, but something that was a little bit more about what does it just mean to be a child, that sense of isolation and perhaps abandonment, or just general confusion of no matter what, never quite fitting in with the rest of the world, and just trying to do these little slice of life scenes and moments that hopefully speak to something that's honest. Now that was made quite a few years ago, so I look at it and I see all sorts of things I would do differently in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
craft, but the emotion of that, is still something I'm still trying to figure out. We're all just kind of telling the same story over and over, anyways.
Yeah, and I will say it's like that's one of the things that I did notice, and it's certainly not a bad thing. And the way, because of the fact that I think each film that you've done is very different, but I do think they all touch on similar themes of
Mhm.
isolation, of trying to figure out your place in the world, and trying to do the best you can in the world, and getting through personal trauma in some cases, and just trying to figure out where life should be taking you. And that's one of the things that I do find is a common thread throughout most of your films. Even something like Jay, which is a documentary, I feel like touches a lot on that basic idea as well.
Yeah, that's really cool to hear you say that. I have this mission statements of my goal is to make films or tell stories that are hopefully evocative and visually captivating, but more so than anything else, they're about damaged people trying their best.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I come back to working on a new script or in the edit or anything else, that's sort of my north star. I think that's the thing that I'm most interested in, which is very broad, very vague idea. Uh, but just kind of exploring, like we all have some baggage, we all have some difficulties, and at the heart of it, I do think we all are just trying to do the best we can with what we have.
Mm-hmm. No, and that's definitely something that comes through. And actually, hearing you mention that and put that connection through about people basically just trying to do your best. I mean, when I rewatched Triplet, which you directed but you didn't have a credited writing cred on, it it felt like when I watched it again, it's like, okay, this is a bit different from what the other films of his that I've seen, and you could sort of chalk that up to you not having written it, but just as a director. But hearing you talk about that common theme, it's like, okay, there's the connective tissue with triplet, which is about a dancer who's trying to get into a ballet troupe, but is having a hard time dealing with the rejection of that she feels in that situation.
Yeah, and I think so. Sonia and Drew, they wrote that script, and I think they did a really nice job with that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm honestly, I'm not sure if I actually even did the script that much of justice, but tried it. But it's a interesting feeling for me, at least, to direct somebody else's material. And it's something I do want to explore a little bit more, and do that a bit more. Hopefully more so in kind of the episodic space a bit. But yeah, with Triplet, I do feel like there is some similarities there. It's a little bit more stylized, especially in terms of performance,
Mm-hmm.
and a little bit less naturalistic. And that's one of the choices that we made on it. Uh, but I do really enjoy that project, and we do these projects from time to time that are almost more like sketches that you would have in a notebook, as opposed to painting a giant mural, something to just get out there and
Mm-hmm.
exercise it out a little bit.
Yeah. There is. I will say though, there is one film that I mentioned at the beginning that does feel very very different from the rest of the films that I've seen of yours and that we've talked about right now, and that is your 2013 short film Joke, which I have to admit is probably still one of my favorite short films that somebody sent me. Actually, I would say one of my favorite films somebody has sent me. I whenever I come back to that, it's just really, it's so unusual. It's so just weird and just really darkly hilarious. And a big part of that is the vocal performance from the quote unquote narrator. I'm just kind of curious where exactly that movie came from.
Yeah, I think it's weird, man. So I think some of the other films, or the majority of the films, are more of this kind of spiritual exploration. But in reality, me and the rest of the team, I would say Joke is probably the closest thing to our actual personalities. Like we make serious stuff, but
Yeah.
like we kind of just screw around and try to come up with like just the most messed up things that we can think of to each other. And I think Joke is probably a decent enough example of that. So Joke was something we wanted to do, kind of an art piece, an experimental piece, but wanted to get a little meta about it and figure out, all right, what can we do that leads you this way, that the entire film is just essentially a structure of a setup punchline.
Yeah.
And we think you think we're saying something profound, and ultimately there's nothing profound to be said. Uh, yeah, so I mean, I don't know. That was really fun. That's one of my favorite things in terms of the making of it, and how it came out at the time. That was just hey, let's try this.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not serious in the strictest sense. Certainly not serious in the same way your other films are.
Mhm.
But I do feel like it's kind of a little tone poem in its own right about the idea of the subjectivity of humor and just this whole idea of what's funny to somebody is not necessarily funny to another person, and sort of going into a darkly humoristic exploration of that in a matter of 3 minutes. And that's something that really struck me when I first saw it, and really loved it back when I first saw it. And it's something that when I watched it again yesterday, it still holds that that strength, I think, as a project. And I mean, even if it doesn't have a whole lot on a deeper level to say compared to like Sea Change or J or what what you need, it definitely, I think it does have something to say, and it has definitely a very interesting voice to it.
Yeah, cool. I'm glad that that you're still digging that. my career, both in narrative and commercials, is built around drama and serious stuff. Uh, but I spend most of my time watching comedies.
Mm-hmm.
Drew, who has a lot of the writing credits with me. He comes from he came up in Second City out in Chicago.
Oh,
So
okay.
he's super gifted improviser and comic. So every once in a while, if we don't do something like that, we'll just go a little crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So we have like a little bit of a deal, like, okay, it's enough of the self seriousness stuff. Let's just do something stupid now.
Well, and that, yeah, I mean, it is nice to hear that there's definitely an itch to do something like that. And I mean, that one, if you can find it, I know you can find it on Vimeo. I'm guessing you can probably watch all of your movies that are available on Crown Chimp, the website.
We are restructuring our site, so I'm not entirely sure what will be there when this comes out.
Okay.
We're setting up a kind of a new blog platform on there for things that we don't consider in like the top 10, 12 projects. So some things will go there. On my site, nickolasduarte.com, in the other videos section there, I also kind of keep a little bit of a mini archive of work.
And I know from watching them all there, I know all of them are up on most of these projects we're talking about are up on Vimeo as
Oh,
well as I
yes. Yep.
believe some of your commercials and stuff like that as well.
Yes.
So going back to your narrative work for a little bit, the one that I think has had one of the biggest impacts on me personally was your 2015 short Sea Change, which is about two sisters, one of whom has a life-threatening abnormality where her bones basically crystallize, and the other sister, who's a nurse, is taking her on a trip to this doctor to try to get her the help she needs. And I think part of it is probably when I watched this, I was coming off of a time where it was kind of tense in terms of my personal family. So that is part of the reason I think it had the impact on me. But the fact of the matter is, I watched it again yesterday, and it still has a really deep impact because it looks at some of the responsibilities we sometimes have to take on for the sake of family. And where did you and Drew come up with the idea for that story?
Yeah. That is, again, like all, these. I'm really glad to hear that that it's connecting and that has some sort of impact, because you don't want to make these things in a void that don't matter to anybody. Um, especially in terms of family, and that's something I've been starting to explore a lot more in the current scripts I'm working on. Uh, is this I don't know if it's a side effect of aging, or getting ready to kind of start my own family or anything like that, but it's difficult to let go, both in terms of the good and the bad.
Mm-hmm.
And family has such a strong hold on us, again, both in terms of good and bad. For me, my family was, everybody thinks their family was unique. So my unique version of it is a foster family with adopted siblings and siblings with special needs. And so that, had its own challenges. Pretty early on, I was put in a somewhat of a caretaker type of position in my family.
Mm-hmm.
So, I know that had a pretty large impact on me. Um, I don't want to speak out of turn, with anything with Drew, since he's not here. But like anybody else, he had his own version of those things as well.
Mm-hmm.
So both of both of our experiences led to wanting to explore something dealing with family and dealing with resentments and feeling that responsibility, whether or not it's self-imposed. uh, and and then also part of it was I had taken a trip down the Pacific Coast Highway about a year earlier with my wife and a couple friends, a
Mm-hmm.
road trip, and just I loved it. I thought it was absolutely gorgeous, and wanted to just go back and make a film out there. So those two things kind of collided, and we came up with the general story pretty quickly. Added in the idea of the crystals to kind of give it a little bit more of a fanciful quality, and hopefully sometimes you get to a deeper truth through something that isn't truly literal.
Mm-hmm.
So we're hoping to do that. I look at the film. I do think that there are, if I'm just being blunt, I think there are some issues with it. Some things that I know both Drew and I would have done differently in terms of script. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm proud of the work, and it was a really enjoyable film to make, and it also led to me starting work with KJ, who's the younger sister in there, and
Mm-hmm.
we've made 5 or so projects with her since then. So all in all, I look back at it with a lot of fond memories, and there's some really, really lovely moments in that film for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's funny because of the fact that you have another film that I basically watched these back to back yesterday when I was rewatching them. Sultan of the Sea, which is
Mhm.
another film about one sibling basically looking after another that seems to have a serious illness, and in the title you're evoking the sea, and you sort of touched on some personal things that make me realize that yes, there is some personal place where both of these came from, and yeah, it was that sort of a conscious decision on your part to have these two very simple and short uh ideas sort of like feel connected in a way.
Honestly, no, not at all. I mean, and that's I spend a lot of time, kind of planning and thinking of, next steps and stuff, but that never really translates into the type of work. It's
Mhm.
more of how am I going to get this work done, or, trying to figure uh, that side of things out. But, it usually just becomes a thing of like, no, I just have to do this.
Mhm.
Or I'm going to go insane if I don't. With Sultan, we were out in LA for some commercial stuff, and a couple of opportunities out there, and KJ was out there at the time, and just a little group of us said, "Hey, let's, here's this really weird area, the Salton Sea, which is one of the most bizarre places I've ever been to.
Mhm.
Uh, let's just make a little short." So, me and KJ wrote something real quick together. Drew came in to act in it. Did that with a really small crew, but the whole thing felt like a summer camp. Honestly, it was one of the funnest, most enjoyable experiences I've had making a film.
Mhm.
Uh, in terms of the thematics, I think family and caretaking is going to be something I'm always interested in. And it's going to be something I probably will continue to explore in different versions.
Mhm.
Um, just as it's a thing that's heavy on my mind. Uh, in terms of the ocean, I'm from Tucson. The desert is a huge part of my life,
Mhm.
so the ocean is still very much an alien thing to me. Um, so a lot of my projects, Sea Change and Salt into the Sea, Trouble Will Find Her has it. Fish Cake has some water stuff. We just
Mhm.
did the short out in Malibu in January. It's kind of a common thread, which I've been yelled at by the team to stop looking at water. Uh, Pretty soon, all of my work is just going to be water.
I mean, if that's the way it
I think
happens, that's the way it
after
happens.
this last one, we did the shootout in Malibu. That was very difficult shoot right on the beach, and it came out great. I'm really proud of the film, but
Mhm.
I think the water itch is out of me, at least for a little bit. Like no more beaches, no more lakes.
Mhm.
Yeah,
At least for a while. I'm sure
for
they'll
a
come
while.
back in at some point.
Yeah, it may just be the next film I do. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Well, you did mention Fishhook and Trouble Will Find Her, and those are two films that I hadn't mentioned yet. But one of the things I did notice rewatching those that both of them sort of like how I felt about Sea Change and Sultan of the Sea. I do feel like Fishhook and Trouble Will Find Her sort of on a continuum with each other, as they're basically about people trying to take their life back after emotional and physical trauma. And it fits right into this idea of isolation, um, of individuals who are struggling with life, with people who are having a hard time in life, and how they're trying to deal with those moments in their life. And what where how I guess I don't know. I'm trying to figure out the best way to put this. It I mean, obviously, it's like other artists certainly find new ways all the time to basically uh, tell similar stories to what they've done before. And I'm just kind of curious. Is there something that you I mean, is there a particular process to trying to figure that out for you personally, or is it just something? Well, this story's interesting to me, so how am I going to tell it?
Huh, I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah, it's one that was kind
I
of
want to give you a good answer
no,
though,
that's
but
fine. That's fine. Admittedly, it was one that sort of kind of came off the top of my head. Basically, each of the pretty much all of the shorts that we've talked about, with the exception of Joke, um,
Mhm.
basically, I feel like they deal on they're basically all on a continuum. They're all basically have similar ideas as far as isolation, as far as people who are struggling in life at particular moments. And I guess is it a conscious decision, I guess, is what I want to know, or if to basically tell these similar stories, and if it is, sort of, how do you go about the process of trying to, of figuring out new ways to tell that type of story?
I got you. Okay, cool.
Okay.
Yeah, I got you. um, so it is both and neither. So the conscious part of it is that I'm pretty committed to working in drama. That's where I feel my particular skill sets, both in terms of working with actors and working with a crew, and those types of stories, and visually, I feel like that's where I excel.
Hmm.
Um, Also, I don't know if I necessarily have the patience to do comedy. I also really greatly respect comedy. I'm okay if I make a bad drama. I would not be okay with myself if I made a bad comedy.
Yeah.
So I want to stay away from that. And I've tried a couple of comedy projects, and I don't enjoy the process as much. The jokes get tired and old to me, versus drama, where you can, really hone in and fine tune moments of suspense or build up, and that doesn't get old to me. So that's more of a personal preference, but that is something that I've, pretty strongly staked my career on. Of this is what I'm going to do.
Hmm.
Uh, in terms of the types of stories, for a while there, I would say in the earlier part of my career, I was very focused. Probably like anybody else in their early 20s, you're trying to figure out who you are and what you're all about. And that's what that time period of life is for. And part of that for me as a filmmaker was trying to figure out, like, okay, well, what filmmaker am I like, or what type of stories do I want to tell? And over time, I've really stopped thinking about that.
Hmm.
And I've gotten to a place where it's just these the filmmaker I'm like is me, and I'm just going to tell the stories that are interesting to me.
Yeah.
Uh, And there's certain degrees that you kind of have to consider as we're deciding, okay, well, which ones are we going to put most amount of resources into, whether it's time or money. There's business things to consider, especially as starting to move throughout that world. But for the most part, the bigger quest for me is just telling something that I can feel good and honest about. The rest of it is in terms of the actual stories. That's not a conscious decision.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it usually gets to the point of I've taken enough notes and ideas and loose thoughts, and I get to a place of I have to do this. Like I have to tell this thing. I have to actively start working and getting this thing into production.
Right.
And it's not even if I don't type of situation. It's just it's more of a compulsion of no. This is just a thing I'm going to do.
Yeah.
Because it's all coming from me. My films are coming from me, like anybody else. There are going to be common threads of things that I'm interested in,
Mm-hmm.
ways that I'm trying to explore things. I might do something that I'm not fully happy with the way that it was executed, but I really like the general idea or concept. So I may revisit that, whether that's a specific type of shot or movements, or general idea or character. So I may come back to that and say, okay, that was the practice run, or that was taking shots on goal.
Mm-hmm.
Let's try to use it again now with something with a little bit of a bigger budget, or maybe something where the elements line up maybe a little bit more in favor. And let me try this thing again because I think I could do this the right way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does. I mean, as a composer, I completely get it because I mean, there's certainly there, especially in my early time of composing, it's like there were people that and ideas that I sort of wanted to emulate and stuff like that. But as I grew older, it occurred to me that it's like I'm more and more comfortable realizing that I have this is my own voice in it, and
Hmm.
it's like trying to, and I'm just gonna work on fine tuning that voice and making that as clear and as interesting to people as possible. And I certainly was not intending, and I really love what you do. I really love the stories that you've told. So it's like I'm perfectly fine with getting more and more like them because of the fact that I think you do approach these ideas. I think one of the things I love about 'em is that I do feel like they're approached very honestly, and I think they're approached with a real sense of humanity that that I feel like cinema does need. Whether it's a short film or a narrative or a feature length film, or whether it's a documentary or a narrative film. I think there's so many. I think there's a lot of great ideas that you're presenting, and yeah, I mean the idea of fine tuning. I mean that's what the greats do. That's what great filmmakers do. It's like most of them, they don't necessarily deviate from what they know, and they just keep working on getting that better. And I really like that there's a commitment to that. And the fact of the matter is you do it pretty well so far. So you do it really well right now. So
Well, I definitely appreciate that, man. And like you're saying with composing, you have to spend any art form that you're going into. Um, those early years of going into it, you're just going to be copying what you've seen other people do.
yeah.
I mean, that's pretty much anybody. That's how we learn.
Yeah.
That's what little kids do. And then eventually it'll get to a place where you'll say, "Oh, this is what I do. This is what I'm about."
Hmm. No, absolutely. And yeah, that's ultimately once that is, I know for me that was sort of a big weight off of my shoulders when I realized that was ultimately, no. I mean, you, rather than trying to do something that you're, or be somebody that you're not, focus more on who you are. And that's one of the thing. I think I think that's a key moment for any artist, regardless of what you're doing.
Yeah, I think you put that really beautifully. Just, focus on who you are.
Mm-hmm.
That's what all of this is about anyways. So, be you and don't apologize for that.
Mm-hmm. And with that note, that's actually a very good way to bring me to the most. I think it's the most well, no, it's not the most recent film of yours that I've seen, but the one that I think definitely has one of the ones that's definitely excited me the most is how did you come to discover Jay Peterson?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways I've discovered Jay. I'm still discovering Jay. So I did a piece of branded content, like a short film for Adidas, a few years back, and I had cast Jay in it. He was an actor, and I really liked what he brought, and so I cast him in that. Um, really enjoyed working with him. I mean, he was one of the most dedicated actors I had worked with
Mm-hmm.
up until that point. Cast him in another thing and another thing. So started to get to know him a little bit over, the few projects that we worked on together over the first couple of years. And then I overheard him talking to somebody, and he was telling them that he paints the soul energy of people.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't that's not necessarily where my belief system sits.
Right.
And I thought it was very interesting, and I started talking to him about it. And again, like anything that you don't fully understand, but you can maybe empathize with, you get a little bit of interest and a little bit of curiosity to it. And so I asked him if, hey, can I, just make like a little short documentary on you and your process? Because he was describing his process and it was very specific and strange to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, okay, I'll make maybe a little 3-minute documentary, right? So I, the day before the shoot, I went over to his place and, just kind of sat down with him to get to know each other a little bit more before going into it. A little bit of pre-interview, is kind of nervous.
Mm-hmm.
And, and I should have been nervous, but I wasn't because I didn't know what I was getting into yet. And so he starts telling me about that, and then he's like, "Well, also, Nick, I feel like maybe you should know this, and maybe this might be interesting to talk about. Is I was born intersex and raised female." And I say, "Oh, yeah, Jay, that's very interesting. If you're comfortable with it, if you're fully
Mm-hmm.
out, then yeah, let's do that." And he had just started, speaking publicly about it.
Mm-hmm.
He had done a recent lecture, and I think to do that felt like this huge weight had been lifted off of him. He spoke at one of the local universities.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started talking, and he's like, "Well, there's some other stuff too, but I guess we could just talk about it tomorrow." And then we did that, that first shoot,
Yeah.
and that was one of the uh, I don't honestly even know how to describe it. Like that 9-hour interview, it was a lot to process, man.
Mm-hmm. I can
And for
imagine.
anybody that's seen the film or seen the trailer for it, my can see some of the thoughts there. Me and the crew just were not fully prepared
Yeah.
at all. Um, yeah, so we did that, and then I sat with that footage for a really long time, just having a difficult time trying to figure out what to do with this.
Mm-hmm.
We had a lot. I knew that there was something there. Um, I had probably the most difficult time was trying to figure out the ethics of it,
Mm-hmm.
where I felt my integrity was. In terms of editorial or authorial voice to telling this person's life when there are elements of it, that that were just troublesome for a few different reasons.
Yeah.
And so trying to figure that out, and we spent some time, honestly, a couple of years, kind of figured out the end to it, and uh, you know we started playing around with the idea of it being maybe a feature, but then that edit did not work at all, and we tried
Mm.
a very short that didn't work. So we ended up at this 20-minute runtime, and a lot of that structure, the editor on that was Matt King, and a lot of just making sense of that story, came from his work on that.
Yeah.
Uh, and once we were able to get that general idea in place, then we came back and we shot all the reenactment stuff. We shot one pickup interview just to make sure we had covered our grounds on
Mhm.
a couple of smaller things that we just need some clarification on. And then from there, we were able to get the rest of that to piece together pretty quickly.
Mhm. It's a fascinating movie. Is absolutely a fascinating movie. It's you start off thinking it's primarily going to be about his creative work, about his paintings of these spectral of these souls of
Hmm.
individuals, and then once you dig deeper and deeper into who he is, it just basically it's it's such a fascinating story. It was such I'd forgotten so much about that. I'd forgotten so much of his story before I watched it again this morning, and I it just sucks me in. It just is really it's I mean it's a lot of it took a lot of courage for him to be able to be that open and be that comfortable with telling this story. And I mean, it's a story that is completely worth telling. And I thought it was beautiful, and just the way and I can completely understand why it was such a difficult edit for you. And you ended up putting it together just so well, and it reminded me of it reminds me a lot of Errol Morris's work. Whether it's Gates of
Mm.
Heaven, whether it's Thin Blue Line, Vernon, Florida, some of his work where you, it's very precise in how it examines the subject, your subjects, in this case Jay's life, and then but the way it does is just it feels very unusual, but it also feels like it's the only way that you could have done that. And I just yeah, it watching it again this morning, I remembered exactly why I loved it as much as I did when I saw it last year.
Yeah, thanks, man. I had not seen the film for about 10 months or so, all the way through.
Mhm.
Um, I was out of the country when it had its actual premiere out in St. Louis in November, so I'd missed that, and I missed some of the other festival appearances. But I did just see it on Thursday. It was screening out here after not seeing it in such a long time. Um, and yeah, I'm proud of it. You know, um, but I don't know. It was just I'm still kind of recovering from that screening a little bit
Mhm.
uh, of experience of sitting there watching in a theater, watching it with Jay right next to me, um, and just hopefully feeling like we did that story the right way, and I feel like there's a lot of wrong ways that easily could have gone.
Oh, absolutely.
Uh, and it's a tough thing to know. How much do you share of certain things? What do you share? I mean, it's somebody's life, or it's somebody's
Mhm.
telling up their life. So you want to be honest to how they view that. Um, but and at the same time, you can't sum up an entire human being's life in 20 minutes. So you have to make
Mhm.
some editorial choices, and those choices will inherently affect the way that people view that life. And I do think that's a huge part too of Jay being brave in doing this,
Mhm.
of knowing that people unless we're there at a Q&A, it's not always a conversation, and people are going to watch it and draw their own conclusions about him and about his life. And for the most part, the reception has been very warm and loving and positive for him.
Mm-hmm.
But that's still a very scary risk. And he risks a substantial amount of judgment in doing that.
Yeah. And no, it was, it really is, for me personally, it was just such an amazing experience to watch that movie, and to just, and watching it again, just getting sucked in all over again. And the direction it takes, the story, that his story is just, it's something that you never expect in you never expect when you start that movie where it's going to lead. And I think by the end of that movie, like you said, it would have been very, there's definitely a wrong way of doing that, to where it could have just been silly. But I don't you didn't it's not silly at all. It's very honest, it's very clear-eyed, and it's, for me, it was very moving. And I'm glad to hear that it's getting mostly a lot of positive uh notices and feedback. And for, yeah, like you said, how brave he was in telling his
Well, and
story.
yeah, and that's been one of the nice things is, after that last screening, seeing people come up to him and want to give him hugs, and
Mhm.
all of that is really heartwarming. In terms of telling the story, the intellectual approach to it was something where we were just like, let's try to do it in a way that how it felt when we first heard it from him.
Right.
And emotionally, let's try to do it in a way where maybe it's a similar feeling to what, you know, obviously we're not going to be able to hit the actual feelings that he
Mhm.
had through all of this, but at least try to get something, analogous to those feelings.
Yeah. No, and it was funny. It's like, on the one hand, I was thinking, on the one hand, it is when you said that you had 9 hours of footage, it's like, oh my word, how did this not end up being a feature length film? And then when you said that just didn't really work, I'm like, I can kind of see that.
Yeah, because the biggest thing was we made the decision, we're telling Jay's story from Jay's point of view,
Right.
which means that this isn't a investigative documentary, or even a piece of journalism to that extent.
Mhm.
We're not going to go to Minnesota and interview some of these other people and try to get to the bottom of things.
Yeah.
That was the story that we were trying to tell. um, it's telling Jay's story the way that he told it.
Yeah.
And so that meant that you really only had this one major voice, which is Jay's, in the film. And so when we did the feature, there's a lot of interesting moments, a lot of good stuff, but as a whole, it loses. It's essentially listening to one person talk and watching them talk for an hour and a half.
Mhm.
Um, which it can be troublesome to maintain engagement during that time period.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can definitely see that the film is the right length to give you at least a glimpse into his life, and into what his life is, and what it is now, and what
Mhm.
was then. And yeah, I really, it's funny because of the fact that it's like, yeah, you mentioned the recreations. It's and that is, I think that's part of where, at least with the Thin Blue Line, it kind of reminds me of Errol Morris, because he did a lot of recreations and
Mhm.
reenactments in that film. But as far as the overall humanity, and as far as the overall just feeling of wanting to be truthful to who Jay is, that's where I feel like the comparison to something like Gates of Heaven is very apt because of the fact that there's no judgment of who he is as an individual. Telling it's just letting him tell you about his life and giving you a window into who he is as an individual and what sort of led him into this into the life he's living now.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, those are some of the most incredible, not just documentaries, but films ever made.
Yeah.
So obviously, we looked to Morris's work for kind of reference points and milestones. I mean, he's one of the masters, if not, the top 3 greatest documentarians.
Yeah.
So yeah, that definitely, was something that we looked at quite a bit because he does such a beautiful job of navigating things that could be difficult to navigate and making it seem very easeful and smooth, objective, but also empathetic at the same time.
Well, before we wrap this up, what do you and what does Crown Chimp have coming up?
Yeah, we stay busy. We got some commercial stuff, some fun commercial stuff going on. We have a series set up with Warner Brothers that takes a fair amount of our writing time, prepping that. I have that short that I talked about that we shot out in January. We're wrapping that up, prepping another short, and working on a feature. So a whole slew of different things, man.
You just answered my next question was if we were going to get a feature from you coming up.
Yeah, one day. I have a whole bunch of feature scripts that we've done some movement on, but it's I'm glad honestly that I haven't made any of them. Knowing where I'm at now and being able to see things with much more clarity. But yeah, there's 2 that hopefully get some good traction on the end of this year, early next year, but very heavy in the writing process on that.
Well, Nickolas, thank you very much for joining me today. I've been wanting to add you to the roster of interviews that I've been doing for the podcast for a while, and I'm glad we were finally able to do this.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me, man. Like I said, always have been very grateful for your support and encouragement over the years, man, and glad to see that the podcast is thriving and doing good, and glad to be a little bit of a part of it.
And that is Crown Chimp Films, www.crownchimp.com, correct?
Yes, just crownchimp.com.
Okay. And you can also find a lot of their commercial work and their short films at Vimeo. You can hit them up on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And thank you very much, Nickolas, for joining me today.
Sounds good.
All right. I'd like to thank Nickolas for joining me today. It was a lot of fun to talk to him. I've got some more filmmaker interviews coming up. I have a podcast I'm doing with a friend of mine on one of my very favorite films, as well as there's always going to be a lot more going on at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. For now, though, this is Brian Scuttle, and thank you very much, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.